Joe Rogan will not be moving to the Great White North anytime soon. The podcaster said on a recent episode that Canada, the country, is, quote, effing falling apart in the wake of strict COVID lockdowns. Let's watch.
Would you ever consider living in another country?
I would have said Canada up until recently. Now Canada's falling apart. All the that they did during COVID was just the total wrong direction. The trucker convoy, when they froze people's bank assets.
You can't make honking your horns illegal.
Bro, they froze people's bank accounts that donated money to the convoy. That's crazy. That's crazy.
And what's so
peaceful protest, which everybody's supposed to be all about.
Right.
These people that were protesting COVID vaccine mandates and the lockdowns, and they went after the people that donated, which is crazy.
Yeah. And you can track all that.
Yeah.
They tracked everything.
They shut their bank accounts down.
That's crazy, man.
I mean, that's true.
It all happened. Everything you said happened.
But also, J.P. Morgan in America debanked Kanye West for anti-Semitism. But, like, being racist and anti-Semitic isn't against the law. I'm sorry, isn't that the whole point of America? I mean, we're living in the country with the highest incarceration rate per capita in the world. And we sit around and we say, well, China, all these other places are authoritarian. But that isn't a restriction on people's civil liberties.
What isn't?
Mass incarceration. We live in a country, I mean, Joe Rogan's someone who, praised someone like Bernie Sanders and suggested that he would vote for him in 2020 because he supported policies like Medicare for all. America is one of the few countries in the entire world where there's even such thing as medical bankruptcy. Canada has universal health care for their citizens. Like, that isn't crazy. So I don't disagree with the critique, but it just seems very myopic to be saying that one specific issue is why you wouldn't live anywhere else in the world, including Canada, when America, despite being the richest country in the world, certainly has its fair share of authoritarian problems.
I wouldn't want to live there because it's just too cold. Yes, America.
You're from Michigan. That's basically Canada.
I'm left Michigan, and I haven't gotten far south enough yet.
Okay,
Unfortunately, I'm stuck in D.C. Canada, I mean, the sad truth is that the U.S. implemented a lot of the same totalitarian COVID policies that Joe Rogan is rightly criticizing that I don't agree with in Canada. I think there was probably even more pressure in some circumstances on policy-wise, maybe not on speech-wise, I don't know. Although they did the protesting stuff, the debanking, I think the pressure coming from the Canadian government was stronger than maybe the pressure coming from the U.S. government. But for all I know, we'll have the something files 2 years from now and find out that the bank files, where we'll find out that our government was instructing banks to do that kind of thing.
Maybe it'll come out in the course of all the Jeffrey Epstein investigations.
Nothing would shock me now. So instead of trying to make comparisons or who's better, who's worse, I'm against all of this sort of COVID totalitarianism, and especially for the speech components. Canada, interestingly, I've noted this before, despite a perception that I think even many conservatives have about Canada as like a much more liberal place or a place with a lot more government taking care of people. Canada ranks consistently by conservative organizations that look at countries like tax and regulatory policies. Canada ranks every year as more free market, free, economically free than the U.S. So there's a way in which, I think the U.S. can almost have like the worst of all worlds in terms of like not having really the social safety net that you want, and then also having not doing that, but then also having tons of government micromanagement of economic issues, but not in a way that actually helps people, but just like helps certain firms and hurts other firms.
Yes, it's cronyism. Our conservatives are worried about screwing Disney and its employees and wokeism. And, pay for play schemes, just like the Democrats. I'm not saying they're any better on the corruption plane, but without giving you anything else. And, also there's a significant amount of kind of a cultural conservatism or kind of a rural conservatism in Canada. Most of the country is very rural, and some of the same attitudes about wanting to protect yourself and have guns and things like that do exist. Do you remember Rob Ford, the mayor of Toronto, who everyone was like, that's Trumpism on the rise and all of that, and then he, that all ended the way that it did with the crack, and there was a lot of scandal there. But they have their own little Americana style flair as well. So I don't know. I do find myself when I push back sometimes in these segments about talking about certain things. Let's say it's because we're talking about COVID or shutting down Parler or the trucker, all of those things, which I've chosen to cover on my own show in some detail because I think that they're significant and important. But the reason why sometimes I get nervous about the focus on those things is because if you never or rarely bring up these existential crises like healthcare and the cost of education, you get to a point where you will forget. It'll fly out of your mind's eye, and you'll be saying things like, "I'd rather live in a country where I die if I get cancer and I'm poor, I just die, because I might get censored on the internet." And maybe that is a choice that you would still like. Maybe you would rather have whatever your perception of freedom online or freedom in your transactions, et cetera, even if that means you give up your ability to afford healthcare. Or maybe you're Joe Rogan and healthcare just isn't a concern for you because obviously you're very wealthy. But for the average person, I think it is a worry that if we shift the lens through which we see our politics to things that are so far away from their basic needs to survive, then you can get away, politicians on both sides of the aisle can get away with saying, well, we're good on wokeness, or we're good on being nice to LGBTQ people. Those are representing our two political poles. Meanwhile, everyone doesn't realize that they're starving and dying until the emergency is upon them. And we've entrenched into our political system that there's no one who can break through who actually can fight for those things.
Yeah, although some people do. We hear there's reporting on this all the time. People leave Canada to come to the U.S. for medical care that they had to wait, that it was going to take too long to get there. So the system doesn't work for everybody. Yeah,
it does work for people, but if you're very wealthy, you can make it work even better for you by forum shopping, and I'm glad that they can do that. Anybody can fly anywhere. You can fly to India and harvest in Oregon and do all kinds of things and break all kinds of laws if you have enough money and you really, really want to. But how many people in Canada die every year from a lack of health insurance?
I don't know.
How many Canadians? Zero. How many Canadians are coming out of giving birth with $70,000 bills from the hospital because they had the audacity to have a child? Zero. Those are distinctly American problems. Medical bankruptcy is a distinctly American problem. Before the pandemic, I'm not sure what the numbers are now. All of my numbers, I apologize, are from when I was working on the campaign and I had to memorize these things. But to cancel all medical debt in the United States of America, it was only like $81 billion, which was the amount that at the time Congress had just voted to raise our defense budget by. So we have all of these endless conversations these days about how, well, all the money that we're spending in Ukraine could have been spent for X, Y, and Z at home. And in the abstract, that's true. But the reality is that even knowing that we only have $81 billion of medical debt out there, and that a president, Trump, who was president at the time, Biden, who's been president since then, could snap their fingers and say, I want to, instead of devoting all of this aid overseas, just say debt jubilee for all of the Americans who are suffering because their relative, God forbid, just had cancer, like so many of us have experienced in our families. They don't do that.
Right.
They don't do that because there's not the political appetite for it, because nobody is talking about how for a relatively paltry sum, you could cancel all medical debt. Now, he couldn't do it by executive fiat the way he could student debt because it's not federally held debt. But it is a choice not to want to devote funds to doing those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, I want to make, it's a major issue to make healthcare affordable, to make catastrophic care available to people,
and preventative care. That's RFK Jr.'s big thing about.
Yeah, we have this screwed up system whereby nobody actually knows what they're paying for anything, and there's every incentive for doctors and then the pharmaceutical companies to charge what ends up getting paid for by a third party, and then you get a bill sometimes months later, and when you have to haggle with. It's so confusing, so complicated, and disguises the real cost of it, so that it's not. I mean, it's not socialism or a market. It's just this in-between cronyist system that works way worse than any other country because they haven't committed either direction. They're straddling a fence in a way that only benefits the big players in that industry. And it's a huge problem.
I mean, we've had some recent progress on this with lowering the price of insulin. And Bernie Sanders has been really leading on this, taking those trips from Vermont by bus across to Canada to buy insulin, where it was 1/10 of the cost of the United States of America, purely because of the greed of drug manufacturers. And so we've had some movement on that. But in 2019, diabetes was
and the regulation that makes it impossible to create a generic insulin.
Absolutely. In 2019, diabetes was literally the 7th leading cause of death in the United States of America, a completely preventable death in most of those cases that is caused in many cases by people rationing their insulin because they can't afford a drug that costs a fraction in Canada of what it costs here.
So the FDA made it illegal to make a competitor.
Right. So I don't want to come down on Joe Rogan. Obviously, he's just talking rhetorically in a casual conversation with a rapper. Like, it's not that serious for him. I'm sure he didn't think too hard about this when he said it. But I do think it's worth a reminder that as much as we are politically focused on certain kinds of issues that do matter, there is definitely a political agenda that can say, look over here at First Amendment stuff. That is genuinely important, but look over here at all of this speech stuff and forget the fact that your family is dying.
Although the COVID stuff is not just speech stuff. It had to do substantially with how we had to conduct our lives and our freedom of movement.
Sure, but it should have been. The COVID was an amazing opportunity. This is what the left was saying during COVID, was an amazing opportunity to be advocating for our broader health rights as a population, not just in the narrow, I hate the COVID vaccine. No, why are we paying for any of these vaccines? Why is it that the country understands, Kamala Harris understands, she tweeted this during the campaign, that it would be immoral to make people go medically bankrupt because they succumbed to a pandemic virus, but not immoral to let someone go bankrupt because it succumbed to cancer or diabetes or a heart attack or anything else. And that is the question that our American political system has yet to answer.
Yeah, but a lot of people also looked at it and said, wow, give the government even a little bit of power, they'll lock me in my homes for years. I can't even cross that bridge.
All right, I object to the idea. I think we can talk about these things without pretending that someone came and put a padlock on your door. But
not in the U.S., but they did in China, they did in other places.
But we're talking about the U.S. versus Canada, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is interesting. More Rising right after this.